I was living in Paris and wondering when I would see various war memorials to people who lived in Paris under the occupation or people who were killed by the Germans under the occupation, wondering how I would have reacted to those choices that they had to make, whether to collaborate or whether to resist or whether just to stay quiet and hope that it ended. But of course I wasn't French, so the dilemma would be different for me. I'm an American. And when I thought about it, I thought, of course, well, there must have been Americans in Paris during the war. And I began to do research and discovered that, in fact, there were thousands of them, of all professions, all classes, black and white, and they did face the same choices that the French faced, and it became a goldmine of material that no one had ever touched before. It's like the beginning of the film Casablanca, where Rick is getting on the train to leave Paris, to flee Paris. Well, this would be the story of Rick in Paris if he hadn't fled. What was interesting about the people of that time was that they were literate, and they wrote a lot of letters and kept diaries. And all of the people that I concentrate on, the four characters that I concentrate on, were particularly literate and actually wrote rather beautifully, and they gave great details of their lives. It's just that the material hadn't been used by historians before, because no one had bothered to look into the lives of Americans in Paris at the time. Someone like Charles Beddoes is one of those I wrote about, and there turned out to be voluminous files in the FBI offices in Washington on him because they were going to accuse him of treason, and some of those files are still locked up. I mean, I was able to get most of them, but the FBI is still holding on to others on the basis of national security, which I'm still trying to get. If there's a second edition of the book, then I might be able to get a hold of those and find out more. But there was far more information on the people in Paris than you could ever fit into one book. I think it would have been one of the most interesting times to be in Paris. There were terrible hardships, but there were also great compensations. People showed a lot of solidarity to one another. People were hungry, and they shared their food with one another. There was rationing, and people would exchange ration coupons for things they didn't eat for cigarette coupons that they might have wanted for them to have more cigarettes for themselves. They also showed an astounding bravery. Sylvia Beach, the proprietress of Shakespeare and Company, made a point of keeping her Jewish staff member, Françoise Bernheim, working in the shop, despite the fact that the Germans didn't want her to, and at considerable risk to herself. And she also went everywhere with Françoise and picnicked with Françoise, even though Françoise was wearing the yellow star that the Jews were forced to wear by the Nazis. And this led to various problems for her, but she did it anyway. She was a very brave woman, and a lot of these people were brave, and probably it was the finest hour of their lives. Out of the few thousand Americans who stayed in Paris throughout the occupation, I was able to concentrate on four. One was the woman who directed the American Library in Paris, who was Countess Clara Longworth de Chambron. Clara was the sister of the former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Nicholas Longworth, and she was related by marriage to President Roosevelt. Roosevelt called her son Rene his cousin, and Rene negotiated with Roosevelt at the beginning of the occupation of France to try to get help for France from the United States. She was a very brave and interesting woman who was later accused of collaboration. The next woman that I studied was Sylvia Beach, who's a great character, who was the publisher of James Joyce when no one else would publish Ulysses. And she stayed throughout the war and was forced to close her bookshop when the Germans tried to steal some of her books. And she was interned for a time, but then came back to Paris and was very close to the resistance. And then there was an American called Charles Beddoes, who was a millionaire efficiency expert who had hosted the Duke and Duchess in Windsor for their wedding and their honeymoon at his chateau in the Loire Valley. His chateau briefly became the United States Embassy and housed hundreds of Americans at the beginning of the Battle of France. And he was a very colorful character, ultimately arrested by the FBI in North Africa and brought back to the United States, and may have been tried for treason, but he killed himself before he was brought to trial. Or he may have been killed, no one really knows. And then the fourth character was probably the bravest of them all, Dr. Sumner Jackson, who was the chief surgeon at the American Hospital in Paris. And from the very first day of the Battle of France until 1944, he was hiding British soldiers, escaped British soldiers, then American soldiers after America was involved in the war, American pilots who'd been downed, helping them to get civilian clothes and false documents to get out of the country. He and his wife and son sent photographs of German naval bases to the Allies in London, which they could then use to target those bases. Extremely brave, but ultimately denounced to the Gestapo and taken off to Germany to concentration camp, he and his wife and his young son.